tired of your riddles and your games. Now tell me what I want to know. I already told you what you want to know. Stop toying with me. It wasn't me that said it. Come again? I didn't say it. It was Luke who said it. Chapter 15 of his book. You know, the irony here is that your weapon that was meant to protect you is what's going to be the death of you. Please don't. Please. Well, that's just freaking weird. Hey, what's up? So I'm a new Sony shooter moving from the Panasonic GH5. So one of the things I did not do with the GH5 was use Vlog because you had to buy it separately, and all the reviews on that said it was just not good enough to use. So I'm coming from that system where also it did not perform well in low light to the Sony a7IV, which I'm shooting on right now in SLOG3. And so I'm learning a log profile at the same time I'm learning the best way to shoot in low light and which color profiles are the best options. So I wanted to know, and you can see from that little film I just shot, I actually intentionally had it lowly lit with just basically one light, and I wanted to know, was it going to look better in S-Cinetone or was it going to look better in SLOG3? And so some of the shots were in S-Cinetone, some were in SLOG3. I'm curious if you could tell the difference, but I'm going to get into the differences that I noticed and which one is actually better for low light shooting on the a7IV. So let's get into it. All right, now right off the bat, I'm just gonna level with you here that this is not going to be an in-depth look at the two color profiles. It's not going to be a Gerald type video. This is going to be just a personal experience video as someone coming from the Panasonic GH5 Micro Four Thirds system to the full frame Sony a7IV. If you want to know why I switched, then I'll leave that card up there and in the description. But basically, I'm trying to figure out all these things for the first time, and so this won't be an in-depth thing. This is just going to be, hey, if you're in a pinch or if you're in a more studio setup and you're going to be shooting in low light, then which color profile is going to be the one for you. So here are some of the things that I've learned. First off, with the S-Cinetone profile, you probably know it's just kind of a run and gun shoot profile. It looks great out of camera. There's not a whole lot of adjustments you need to make in post. You just need to stylize it to the creative look that you're going for and you are done. It's great and it actually performs really well in low light, but you're not gonna have a whole lot of leeway in post. You're not gonna have a whole lot of extra room to push the colors around quite as much or the exposure. So you're gonna have to make sure that you got it right in camera for sure. S-Log is Sony's log gamma curve profile, and so obviously that's going to give you more leeway and more dynamic range, and it'll let you push the colors around better, especially I should say if your camera shoots in 10-bit. So if you're in a Sony like a7 III or something that only shoots in 8-bit, don't use S-Log because the 8-bit can't handle the it's just don't do it. The 8-bit can't handle the pushing that you want to do with S-Log to really make it worth it. So you need to have a 10-bit Sony camera in order for that to happen. But if you have the 10-bit and you're ready to shoot an S-Log, you need to make sure you're not shooting any lower than Sony's native S-Log ISO. So for the a7IV, and I believe it's the same for the a7S III, FX3, you need to be shooting in no lower than 640 ISO, and the ISO exposure when you're setting that on the camera will have, you know, the bars above and below those numbers saying, hey, don't go below that. It's not ideal. So as I said, with S-Cinetone, it's pretty much what you see is what you get. You're not going to get any surprises. If you don't really see noise in it while you're recording, you're probably not going to see that much in it in post. You know, you should have an external monitor to help gauge that if you're not quite sure, because sometimes it's hard to tell on the little screens. But with a log profile, it's not quite so simple. The hardest thing for me as I'm trying to figure this out is to make sure that I nail the exposure and what the different exposure settings do for your footage. There's a lot of weeds that we could get into here to explain all this, but I will just link a lot of the videos that I referenced below, and if you want those details, you can go check them out. But in short, what you're going to want to do in order to get the most detail out of your shadows is to overexpose your image by 1.7 to 2 stops. This comes with a huge caveat because it is subjective to your creative preference and what you want to do. You're actually going to get more contrast that way, because you're gonna have to bump down the shadows, and you can see it in the waveform in your editing software. But your dynamic range in the highlights might be compromised by using that method. It really just depends on your scene. And again, reference some of those videos below to see what I'm talking about. To show you what I'm talking about, I did this shot with the exposure meter reading 0, meaning it was perfectly exposed in S-Log. And then this shot was 1.7 stops overexposed. So you can kind of see the difference. There's more contrast in the overexposed one, but the highlight roll off does not look as pleasant to me in this scene. This would be especially applicable if you're like outside, or if you're in a forest where there's light flickering through leaves or something of that nature. So that was information that I learned that is kind of a, take it for what it is. You kind of have to know those things when you're trying to expose for S-Log. So when you're shooting in low light, and a lot of the stuff that I watched when I first got this camera, people were saying that don't use S-Log for low light. But the more I've learned and the more I've kind of figured out using a camera and stuff like that, I've actually come to a little bit of a different opinion. So here's why people say that, and here's why it is kind of credible to some degree. First off, with S-Cinetone, it does not require nearly as much light in order to get your exposure to what it needs to be, and with no noise. So for instance, this is a perfectly exposed shot in S-Cinetone, and I kind of did it with a high contrast scenario, so you can kind of see it was very low lit. But this is that same shot in S-Log, and I had to bump the ISO up a ton to get it to match exposure. So you can see you don't need nearly as much light with S-Cinetone as you do in S-Log in order to get the same amount of exposure on the sensor. So it's for that reason people will say you should shoot in S-Cinetone or something like that, not a log profile, in order to shoot in low light situations, because you're not introducing as much noise by bumping up the ISO. The a7S3 and FX3 perform particularly well in this regard because they have that second native ISO at 12800, in which case you can bump your ISO really high and the image cleans up. Whereas what I found with the a7IV is that once I start hitting that 12800 or higher, that's when it can be usable, but you definitely start to see noise being introduced in the image. So in that regard, if you're just gonna point and shoot, and even if you're in SLOG3 and you turn on the built-in LUT so that you can see what it'll actually look, or close to what it'll look in post, you just hit that little button on the camera and you can actually see what the log profile would look like converted to Rec 709, so it's not so flat. So I like to use that when I'm actually shooting, and I can see a better representation of what the image is. Sometimes that can be deceiving, but it is really helpful. So with that option, whether you're using that or you are trying to just straight up use S-Cinetone or something like that out of the camera, then you can still actually shoot really good images in low light, because this is a really good camera. And so why I kind of disagree with you should shoot in S-Cinetone in low light is because yes, it's going to be a quick way to get a great image out of camera. You can get really good low light even in S-Log, and you can do other things to compensate for having to bump that ISO. So I mentioned before that a lot of people recommended bumping your exposure up to, up to 2 stops overexposed in order to expose correctly for S-Log. While that might be technically correct, it's not really necessary, and I actually kind of like the look better of maybe clipping the blacks just a little, not a lot. You can still retain a lot of detail in them, but having that nicer highlight roll off, I think actually looks more cinematic and more appealing to look at. And so as long as you're comfortable with that, and you know you don't actually have to overexpose that much and introduce that much ISO extra and bring in more noise, knowing you don't have to do all that actually gives you a lot of freedom to feel a little more comfortable to shoot in low light scenarios. So in this little short that I did at the beginning, you can see that there is this clip here at the beginning that's kind of a tighter shot on my face. This first one was an S-Cinetone. You can see kind of right out of camera that it looks really good, S-Cinetone. There's no noise, there's none of that. But once I used the SLog version, you can actually see there's way more saturation, more color, and more ability to push the colors around, and you can tell there's still no noise. And that whole background had a lot of blacks. Some of them were kind of clipped, but you can even see the difference in the S-Cinetone. You're not looking at an image that's really that compromised. And so, in my opinion, the S-Log actually still gives you way more wiggle room in post to kind of do what you want to do with it, and it's still going to be a little bit more forgiving. Now, where you have to be careful with this is because I've shot with this in a couple of different scenarios now, and I have actually tried to trust my screen without using any of the waveform or metering or anything, and the image was actually a lot harder to recover because I was trying to overcompensate by overexposing, and it actually kind of destroyed my highlights and made the image way too contrasty, and I actually liked the S-Cinetone better. So that's why I say, like, knowing that you don't have to overexpose actually really helps. So it helped in some of the scenarios that I was messing around with at my church. It also helped with this little short film that I did. So the biggest thing that I learned and am continuing to learn as I'm shooting with a log profile is that the best way to tell if you're exposing properly or getting the best image is to not necessarily just expose for the highlights or expose for the shadows or expose for the skin tones, which a lot of people talk about, because that'll all change depending on your scene. The best way to expose is to have an external monitor or something that can give you false color. I've never used false color before. It's always looked scary to me when I've watched other videos, and so when I started using it, learning about it, I was a little intimidated, but now I think it's actually one of the easiest ways to tell if something is overexposed, because I can look at an image and in an instant I can tell, okay, I'm exposed for the skin tones. The skin tones, which by the way should be between 50 or 60 IRE. Some say 55 to 65 IRE. I think all of that is fine and kind of subjective, but as long as you're not really above 65 or 70 IRE on the skin tones, if you're doing like a talking head video like this, I think that works the best. But you can see in false color how everything is exposed, and if you're clipping anything or overexposing anywhere, or if you're exposing for the skin tones, and it depends on your scene, and that actually gives you all the information you need to know, in my opinion. That's the easiest, quickest, most helpful way to do that. And again, if you need some help figuring out how to use false color, I will attach another video because people are way better at explaining it than I am at this point, because I'm still a noob when it comes to shooting in log profile. So this is what I have learned out of the last couple months using this camera and profiles like S-Log. And so hopefully this helps you kind of shortcut your way into figuring out if you're in a pinch and need to know, do I need to use S-Cinetone or can I use a log profile? Hopefully this helps you out and gives you some clarity and helps you make your own decision based on what your use case is. And as I continue to learn, I will continue to post more videos, maybe in more detail about these things that I have talked about or introduced in this video. If that's something you want, let me know in the comments below. But that's all I've got. Hopefully this was helpful to you. If you did like it, or if you enjoyed this, I would love it if you hit that like button and subscribe for more videos like this. If you like camera stuff, or if you're wanting to learn more about Sony cameras, or if you're transitioning from a Micro Four Thirds system yourself, or if you're thinking about it, again, this is where I'm at in my video production season, and so I encourage you to just follow along with the journey. So that's all I got for you guys. Thank you for tuning in. Catch you in the next video.